Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing. Professor Dimitri van der Linden, thank you for joining me on the Mental Wellbeing Show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited for this one to discuss flow. It's a topic I've come across the last few years, but never really dove into deeply. So to be able to learn off you is a really cool opportunity. I want to start by asking you, what is flow?
Okay, so flow is a specific state that you can enter when you, for example, work on a specific task. So a very obvious example is gaming. So when young people are engaging in a game, like a computer game, and most of the time, if it's very exciting, if it's a very nice game, then people at some point really get in a flow. They sometimes also refer to it as in the zone, being in the zone. And well, there are a few characteristics of that. So one major characteristic is that you have a very intense focus, right? So all your energy, all your attention is really focused on the task at hand. So that's maybe the most important component. And it also implies that you don't think about anything else. So normally when you work on something, when you do something, you can have all kind of thoughts about yourself in the past, or what might happen in the future, or currently how you're feeling. But when you're in a flow, kind of these types of thinking, this type of thought is very low. So that's of course connected to the very strong focus. You get a changed perception of time. So what happens is time goes very quickly. For example, if you at work and you are in a flow, then you will start working, and at some point you say, well, it's already 6 o'clock. I didn't even notice. So that's also a very typical symptom or characteristic of flow. So I can imagine most people have some sense of what it is. I mean, young people often call it in the zone if you're a gamer, but really doing something that you're really kind of involved in. And also if you're, for example, if you're performing arts, like if you're a dancer or you're on stage, sometimes everything goes very smoothly, and then you can say, well, I'm in a flow. So that's the state. And well, flow typically tends to occur in a situation in which the task you're working on is kind of intermediately difficult for you. So if it's a very easy task, well, then you can do it kind of automatically. And the consequence is that you, while you're working on the task, you might get all kind of other thoughts about what you still have to do tomorrow, or how nice it was that you did yesterday, or maybe think about other things. And so very easy tasks are not typical associated with flow. Also, if the task is very difficult, you really also need your focus. Well, if it's very, very challenging, you might get in a flow. But if it's too difficult, what you see is often people make errors and you become a bit frustrated. And if you're frustrated, if you make errors, you get stressed, then also that's not really flow. So that the most likely area in which flow will occur is in the intermediate area, when it's, a task is quite challenging, but you still are able to do it quite okay.
So that's kind of skill challenge match, right?
A match between the skill and your challenge. Yeah. So for example, again, let's go back to the gaming. You start with a certain level 1. Well, it's quite difficult, and then but after some point you kind of know how to perform this level, and then well, you don't do the same level again, because that would be boring, right? Because it's not a challenge. So you go to the next level. But if the next level is too difficult, that's not nice. So it's that's why gaming is also very easy to get in the flow when you're gaming.
And one of those kind of key components of flow is that this term that I know Cheek sent me, the prominent flow researcher, termed Autotelic experience. Can you run us a bit through that, or what that is?
Yeah. So the idea is that the activity you engage in when you are in a flow, in somehow the state of flow is actually also rewarding. So it feels positive. So there's, of course, in science, there's a question whether it's really, if you're really happy when you're in the flow, you're not necessarily happy, but it feels okay. It feels you do something right. And so if you look at the brain areas, for example, you also see that certain brain areas that are related to dopamine, that to reward, they become active. So that indicates that flow for your body, for your mind, is rewarding. And it also means that, well, if you have something like that, you would experience that again. So it's something you want to do more. You want to have more of it, actually.
Yeah, it seems like flow is almost addictive, right? Because it is intrinsically rewarding in and of itself, and something that's, like you said, activates that dopamine reward system. So we're more likely to want to chase that again. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm what I refer to. So it's rewarding. And if something is rewarding, you want to kind of do that again, experience that again.
When we think of flow and we have those components, is flow this kind of state where either you're in or you're not in, or is it kind of on a dimension where you may not necessarily be in that optimal experience kind of zone, but you can still augment the level of skill challenge match, the level of perceived timelessness. So even if you're not quite in that optimal zone, you can still move closer to it.
Yeah, probably it's a dimension. It's because really being in the flow is like an optimal state. When you, for example, performing on stage, a sequence you learned very well. It's a very specific and unique experience. But before you're there of course also different stages. So you can also have like a focus state in which you show some characteristics of flow, but you're not actually in a flow. So, for example, if you want to study flow in the laboratory, then you can give people tasks, and it's very unlikely that in this situation, in this lab, they are in a unique experience of full flow. What is more likely is that they experience kind of a focus. They notice that the time, goes very quickly. So it's not the full flow, but it's towards the flow. So it's like different stages of focus. And actually, that's also a question in yeah, in science, is that is flow actually a very unique experience? Eh? Is it something that's unique and very different from all other experiences, or is it just a very intense state of concentration? And at this point, that's still unclear, because most of the research on flow has been done with subjective reports, observations, and you see that people are in a certain state. But in terms of the neuroscience behind it, it's not clear whether it's something really different or just intense focus.
Well, yeah, that point about researching flow and measuring, particularly measuring brain regions in flow, I imagine it must be hard to do that because I can't imagine myself being in a flow state if I've got like an EEG cap on or if you throw me in an fMRI scanner, right? So how do you measure the brain regions of flow, or can we even directly measure that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so, as I said, it's very difficult to reach an actual flow state when you're in a lab. On the other hand, if you can give people a task, maybe, if you go in a lab, it might be a bit awkward in the beginning. But when you work on a task and the task is challenging, it's not too difficult. And then you see that actually people, even in the lab, get engaged in the task. And then you ask them certain dimension. You ask them, well, did you have a strong focus? Did you think about a lot of other things? So what you probably will find is not that they are in a full flow, but they are kind of they have characteristics that resemble flow. And then you have the subjective reports, and you can link that to what's happening in the brain. So but it's very challenging to induce flow in the lab. In the lab, actually, what is more difficult is also you can have, if you look at EEG, for example, if you measure EEG, well, then the task also need to be a bit controlled. So you need to know when something happens in the task, because you want to link that to certain areas in the brain and certain activity in the brain. And that even means that for example, you can't just give a game, because in a game many things happen. People move, and then something pops up, and so in that way you can't analyze the brain waves, for example, in relation to what's happening on the screen. So that's another difficulty or challenge, that you need a task that's engaging, that might induce flow, but on the other hand, it also needs to be a bit controlled. So what we did, for example, we now have a study in which we did a very common neuroscientific test. It's called the NBAC task. You have to kind of see whether something you see on the screen is the same as you saw on 2 screens before. So it's a very neuropsychological test, but we made a kind of a gamified version of that. So in this case, the stimuli were aliens that wanted to enter the world, for example. And you had to kick them out if they're the same.
And what are you measuring in that particular study there?
So in this study, we looked at EEG, and we looked at specific markers, and we also looked at the magnitude of the pupil. And what we want to measure is whether we see indications of involvement of a specific structure, namely the locus coeruleus system. And that's, of course, you would be able to measure it directly in the brain, but that's very difficult, also with fMRI. So what we do is we look at indicators of the system, looking at EEG, looking at the eye, because the eye is assumed to reflect that system partly.
Okay, so let's discuss some of those brain regions then. So you said the I'm not even going to try and say it, but the LCNE system and the dopaminergic reward system. So yeah, can you talk us through some of those brain regions involved in flow?
Yeah, so the idea is that if you want to be in a flow, then of course the first condition is that the task has to be rewarding. The task has to have some meaning, because otherwise you would not get in a flow in the first place, right? So if you have to do some administration or a very boring task, then your brain says, well, this is boring. You know that it's boring, and then flow will not occur. But if you engage in something that you think is nice, just by doing it, or you think, well, it might not be nice in itself, but if I do this, I might get some reward. If I train hard, I might win the competition. So the brain has to decide that this is a task worth investing in. And how does the brain do that? Well, the dopamine system, the motivational system, and the locus coeruleus system, they both play a role in determining whether it's useful to invest in a certain task. So, and of course, that's the major condition of flow, is that you need to be involved in the task. You need your brain. Of course, you have the feeling that you decide, but it's your brain that decides, okay, so now this is something worth spending a few hours on. And these two systems, they play an important role in that. And then once they do, so once those systems decided that it's worth investing in, then they feed into other brain systems that help you to focus. And then, for example, we talk about systems that regulate the attention, the cognitive control. And there's another system that's called the default mode network. And the attention network and the default mode network actually are more or less opposites. Not 100%, but what you often see is that the one becomes active, the other becomes less active. And the default mode network, that's a brain area that's related to thinking about yourself. So now in this case, you have to listen to me. So probably you're a bit focused, hopefully. But for example, if this is over and you're sitting on a couch, just wondering, looking around, then it's very likely that the default mode network becomes active, and you start thinking about how this recording went, or what you have to do tomorrow. So these kind of thoughts are often related to activity of the default mode network, kind of a daydreaming. And of course, one characteristic of flow is that thinking about yourself, daydreaming, thinking about other things that are not related to the thing you're working on at that moment, this is very low when you're in a flow. So then we think, okay, then the default mode network might be very not very active. It might be inactive. Whereas the other system, the attentional network, might be quite active because you're engaged in the task, you're focusing. So it's a mix of different systems.
So when you say the default mode network and its responsibility in kind of mind wandering, thinking about the future, the past, what's coming to mind is mindfulness. And I know that you have something called like flow proneness, right? Which is like a trait disposition for flow. So I'm wondering, is there a relationship between, say, like higher trait mindfulness and being more in flow or having higher flow proneness? You know, even if you haven't done any research, do you think that might be a place to look?
Yeah. So flow proneness, everybody can get in a flow. So if for everybody there are tasks that are rewarding, that are interesting, like give us some meaning, and so everybody can get in a flow. But you also see that people differ in the extent to which they might get in a flow during their daily lives, and there are certain characteristics that might be different in these people that are very flow prone. And one of the things they found is that, for example, they have higher density of dopamine receptors. And that actually means that those are the people that are that respond to reward quite well. So those are the people that get very enthusiastic when they do something nice. I mean, for example, let's say we do something nice, you have 10 people and they're all going to do something nice, then some people get just more enthusiastic about it. They are more involved and, they can really get into it. And so if you have this active reward system, for example, then it's very likely that you also get in a flow more often. Also, on the contrary, there are also people that tend to worry a lot. They have a more kind of different brain systems that the stress gets very easily activated. And if you're a person that worries a lot, yeah, by definition, almost that's kind of counter to getting into a flow, because flow means that you're without worries. You don't think about the negative things that might happen. You don't think about other things that might happen. You think about working on the task. That's one of the reasons why flow is also considered to be positive for well-being, because if you in a flow, you forget your worries. You forget things that might kind of bother you, and well, it's kind of also a kind of an escape.
So if someone's like higher in, say, the personality trait neuroticism, theoretically, they might have less flow proneness, right? Because they're more likely to experience that anxiety and worry.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm actually not sure whether there are studies that directly. I think there are studies that directly tested flow and the big five, and what you indeed see is that there are negative correlations with neuroticism.
Then it makes sense to me then extroversion and maybe even openness, would they be positively correlated with flow proneness?
Probably, yeah. The extroversion, and I'm thinking about the literature, and yes, actually that's true. And I remember that there are studies that tested the big five, and they found that most of the traits, the big five traits, are positively related to flow proneness, but neuroticism is negatively related to flow proneness. So openness and extroversion are positively related to flow proneness, yeah, indeed.
So are there ways to kind of exogenously increase the brain activity of the LCNE, the dopaminergic reward system, such that we are more likely to be in a flow system? For example, caffeine, would that, help us, become more alert and get more activation in the LCNE system?
Yeah, so yeah, caffeine helps to get in a focus, and if you're more easily in a focus, then it also helps you to get in a flow more often. So yeah, all these kind of substances that increase your dopamine system, or directly or indirectly, that increase your focus, they might help you to get in a flow. Of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be like that, because it's also, you need other conditions. You need a task that is meaningful. But yeah, of course they can help in that way. There's also ways of for example, what we do in our department. There are people that work on, they call it playfulness. And the idea is that if you work on something and the task might be maybe a bit boring, or it might not be, a bit stressful, but if you kind of reframe it in your head, that you make it a kind of a game, then it's also more likely that you get a focus, and maybe you get engaged or in a flow. So, for example, if you're if you're a chair in a meeting, and yeah, you kind of make it a game that you try to find, the people that are, that everybody talks just about the right amount of time. So you make it a game for yourself, and then you can imagine that in such a framing, then it's more likely that you get in a flow.
So we've touched on this a little bit throughout the conversation, Dimitri, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the benefits of being in flow.
Yeah, so there are several benefits. One of the benefits is that at the moment you're in a flow, you kind of don't have much worries. Your stress system is kind of deactivated. So you can imagine that sometimes I can also even recall that sometimes there are periods when something happened and you really kind of think about it a lot, you ruminate a lot. And then, of course, when you do so, it's also very tiresome, when you're always thinking about the same thing and you think about worries and what might happen. And then if you have some task you can work on for a couple of hours, you notice, hey, whoa, that's nice. I kind of worked on this for a moment. I forgot, the things I'm worried about. Well, it gives you an immediate relief of your worries. So that's one of the things that might be positive. On a more longer time perspective, well, in relation to work, if you have a certain job and you kind of like the job, or you kind of work in a flow most of the time, or a lot of the times, it also gives you a sense of meaning, of performance. So the task itself does not even have to be very complicated or very high, standard. Even if you have a very simple job, if you enjoy the job and you really kind of make it kind of a game, you play, you get in a flow, it gives you a sense of fulfillment, if you know what I mean. So yeah, it gives you also a long-term perspective of that you kind of doing something well. So you have the immediate relief and you have the long-term effects of being in a flow.
So it seems like flow is, and I know there's been so many studies done on flow across so many different contexts, right? And all these benefits you're talking about, they've been shown to play out in different contexts, in different cultures. So context being in sport, gaming, like you said, more work and
Arts, science.
so this is something that we can all kind of benefit from, I suppose.
Yeah, one of the ideas, of course, also is that when you're in a flow, you perform at your personal best, right? So it doesn't mean you have to be in the absolute best, but I mean you do the best you can do with your abilities, because you're not distracted by other things, and then most of the people also can kind of imagine how this will go. For example, if you have to do something, do you do sports or something yourself?
Yes, sports and exercise a lot. Yeah.
Okay, so but not competition or
Competition, but very low level, so social / competition. Yeah. We keep score, but we're not very good.
okay, what kind of sport?
Soccer.
Soccer. Okay, so I mean, you can imagine that there are sometimes you have to play soccer, and then but you also think about a lot of other things because something happened the day before, or you still have to go somewhere afterwards, and you're thinking about that. And at the moment you play soccer, you're not the best version of yourself because yeah, you notice that sometimes you miss, the balls more often, and so the moment you're in a flow, you don't have this distracting thought. So you play the best you can be. And it doesn't mean that you become the world's best player of soccer. But I mean, for you, with your abilities, when you're in a flow, you reach your maximum. So that always also afterwards feels good. That's another way of how flow can lead to positive well-being, because you really have the idea that you performed the best you can be.
I love that. Almost like actualizing on your potential in whatever the context, whatever the task.
Yeah, your potential. Yeah, actually, that. Yeah. And for example, because even if you have this programs like America Got Talent, maybe you also have the version of Australia Got Talent, and sometimes there are people that they might actually not be able to sing very well. Actually, they might sing very bad. So in absolute sense, they do not perform well. But you can imagine that even sometimes they are in a flow, so they just don't have a good voice, but they perform, the best they can do.
Well, I mean, that example of Australia's or America's Got Talent, that's kind of the component of the lack of self-consciousness, right? You lose the awareness of what other people are thinking of you in the moment, right?
Yeah, so that's of course the lack of self-consciousness is in some cases then it's more general. Yeah? So if you want to go on stage and you really are not performing that well in general, then that's a more general lack of self-consciousness. But the self-consciousness in relation to flow is that when you're performing and then at the moment you want to perform, you actually don't want to be self-conscious. So it doesn't matter, I mean, there were a lot of things that were going on before people went on stage. So the question is, why would this person go on stage in the first place? Many different things. But once the person is on stage, you don't want to think at that moment, oh, am I doing okay? What other people might think of me? So then at that point, you only need to perform. And if you do so, then afterwards, it might still not be good, but at least you have the idea that you tried the best you could do.
So is it possible to multitask whilst in flow?
Yes, I think so, because the complexity of the task is not necessarily kind of a major characteristic in whether or not you experience flow. So you can have a task which is very focused, but you can also have a task in which many different things happen at the same time. So, for example, let's say you're a firefighter and there are many things going on. So you need to rescue people, you need to go there, you need to kind of keep eye on your people, your own people. So in that sense, you're multitasking, but you can nevertheless be very strongly in a flow. Or for example, in certain social events where people are kind of coming to you, or so in that case, you'd have to kind of divide your attention over different things, but all these things relate to the general task you're kind of executing at that moment. So multitasking in itself does not interfere with flow. Multitasking in flow can interfere with flow if it's interruption, if you know what I mean. So, for example, if I'm working on writing a paper and then somebody asks me something, then I get interrupted, and then it disturbs the flow. So it depends on how you define multitasking. If you say multitasking, you have to do several things at the same time in the task, no problem. If you say multitasking, first work on that a bit, then shift to something else, then it might be more difficult to get in the flow. Yeah.
We've discussed the benefits of flow, Dimitri, but in researching for our discussion, it became apparent to me that flow isn't this panacea. It isn't always adaptive. It isn't always functional. So what are the drawbacks of flow, and when can it actually be a hindrance?
I think so. It's rewarding, and if it's rewarding, it's also slightly addictive, maybe. Yeah? Not in the same sense as drugs, of course, but everything that's rewarding, yeah, to some extent, you want to experience that again. And if that's related to useful tasks or tasks that helps you advance in life, for example, then it's most of the time it's positive. But you can also imagine that you kind of lose yourself in a certain task that might not be beneficial for you at the long run. For example, let's go back to gaming again. So gaming can be very nice, it can be very distractive, but what if you spend hours and hours working on gaming for the same for weeks, for months, for years maybe, and then neglecting other duties? So in that case, the flow and the experience of flow and the fact that you want to experience it again might be negative.
Flow is quite resource intensive, right? A lot of people feel tired, feel fatigued after being in flow because it uses so much, for example, attentional and cognitive resources, right?
Yeah, that's actually the thing I wanted to say is also, so the other process, that's one thing in which it can be bad. The other thing, it might be bad, but we're not sure yet, is that it kind of consumes resources. You might be very tired after flow. Um, on the other hand, what you also see is that when people are in flow, they also feel often less tired. So, for example, if you have a working day, 8 hours, you start at 9 o'clock, and then before you know it, it's 5 o'clock, and you really say, "Well, this day I was really like most of the time I was in a flow, not always, of course, but wow, this is really a day with a lot of flow." Then you don't feel more tired; you feel actually maybe even more energetic. Um, so yeah, it might be that you get fatigued, but it's not necessarily so. Sometimes you get even more energy. Of course, if you do something, for example, in the night, you game, you have to perform something like you do sports, and then you're on a flow. You can imagine that once you finish, well, then you're really tired. But on the other hand, it doesn't need to be negative, as long as you don't push it too far.
Flow at work. You mentioned this before, Dimitri, and I read a couple of papers that we looked at PWD, playful work design. Can you talk us through about some of that research?
The idea is that so if you have a task, you might be able to kind of make the task more enjoyable or more competitive by reframing it. So if you work on a assembly line and you have to kind of put boxes, you fill boxes or something, I don't know what kind of job you can have, but it might be intrinsically boring. It might not be very exciting. But for example, if you frame it like, okay, so yesterday I had 50 boxes in an hour. Today I want to try 55. So in that case, if you do it, if you frame it like that, you kind of induce a competition with yourself, and then a kind of intrinsically maybe boring task might be less more exciting. And if it's more exciting, you get more focus, and if you get more focus, then it's also more likely that you get in a flow. So the idea of making task more playful by making it more fun, making it more competitive, it might be one way of kind of trying to induce more engagement, more flow.
In a learning perspective, I'm wondering how we can augment flow because so I do like a lot of reading, listening to podcasts, etc. And often I get frustrated when I'm not able to retain or recall the information later on despite having put in the work. And my hypothesis, although I haven't seen this directly in the literature, is that if I'm in a flow state at the learning stage when I'm kind of intaking this information, if I'm higher on that flow state, my recall is more likely to be higher later on, and it's more likely to be kind of learned at a deeper level, all other things being equal. So my question is, if in terms of learning, studying, and taking in new information, how can we augment flow at the encoding phase?
This is a difficult question, and I don't know the direct answer because yeah, at one point you can say, well, okay, if you flow, you kind of record the material more to at a deeper level. That might be possible, but on the other hand, maybe it's also because the material itself is at a certain level that matches with your skills. So most of the time, when you encounter something new or that's something that's quite difficult, well, yeah, it's not necessarily related to flow. You really kind of have to think about a lot of steps. Um, so you need to have some background, and you need to do something that's a bit more difficult than what you already know, but not too difficult, not too easy. So in terms of learning, sometimes you might get some material maybe in a podcast or you listen to something, and then it becomes too difficult, or too boring, or the presentation is not, like engaging enough. And then what you probably will notice is that you kind of start to drift off, and then you forget more material. So I'm not sure if flow itself helps you to encode material better. Although you would say that might be because higher focus means more processing, more attention given to the task at hand. Yeah, so. But the evidence for that is, for me, not clear yet. But in terms of um, the process of learning itself, of course, if you try to read a book, for your study, and well, it is really interesting, and you're engaging, and you kind of notice that you really get into everything you read, then you can imagine that afterwards it feels more satisfying, and you might also have learned indeed more compared to when you read a book and every time you kind of think about some other things, you're wandering off, your mind's wandering off. Yeah, that's another optimal state for learning also.
Yeah, it seems, and intuitively it seems plausible, but yeah, I'd love to see a research study or two be done on that.
What a lot of studies are also done under the label of engagement. So we have this concept of job engagement, work engagement, and they also call it study engagement. And officially it's not flow, but in terms of the overlap, it might actually be quite a lot of overlap with flow. So if you want to look at literature on a study and the most effective way of studying, it might be worth looking at study and engagement.
Okay, interesting. I'll check that out. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. How do you go about augmenting flow in your own life as a flow researcher yourself? How do you go about implementing these strategies?
I'm not sure if I actually consciously use certain strategies. So I don't think, okay, I'm going to do this in order to enhance my flow. I just, what I notice is that I always try to search as much the tasks that I really like and really find useful. So for example, I like writing, and so I try to kind of make as much time possible available for writing. And of course, if you work at the university, you also have to do a lot of administrative stuff, and it's by definition almost anti-flow. So I always try to reduce that as much as possible. Of course, that's not always possible, but you have to, try to, because even that, there's research on that. They call it job crafting. So do you know the term, job crafting?
I've seen the term in the literature. Yes, I've seen it. Changing the nature of your role or job, right?
Yeah, a little bit. So in every job, of course, you have to do certain things that are fixed, but the type of roles, the type of activities can still differ a bit. So because there are always different tasks, and then for each person, the enjoyment or the kind of the time you want to invest in certain tasks, it might differ. So, for example, I might like writing. So for me, writing can lead to a flow. But a colleague of mine has the same job as me. I not like writing that much. So this person might be more engaged in, for example, going to companies, going to organizations, talk to them, do more media performances, or do other things, engage with students. So even in the same job, you can pull certain tasks towards you that more likely give you flow.
Is there anything finally, Dimitri, that you wanted to share with listeners? You have the floor.
Mm, well, I think we discussed most of the things. I would say that okay, flow is of course a lot of studies have already been conducted, but the nice thing now that we see late maybe 5, 6, 10 years is that people also get interested in seeing what happens in the brain. And at this moment, we're still in the beginning, but yeah, that might be a very interesting area. So for students that are interested in that, I think there's still a lot of things to gain there.